There we go. Well, it's all fun and games, ladies and gentlemen, but finally I can actually say hello, good evening and welcome. Thank you for your patience there at the start, and thanks for joining us at the first ever Melton Mowbray Transition Town event. We've got an engaging and thought-provoking evening ahead of us. My name is Alistair McQuillan, and I'm here to facilitate this session. I'm going to be hearing from two different panellists this evening, who you've probably just already seen on your screens. We've got David Davis and Rob Hopkins. I'm going to be doing a little bit of housekeeping for us just before we start, as we're sort of still getting a bit used to this, as you can tell we definitely are. You can interact with us in two different ways this evening. On your screen, either down at the bottom or up at the top, is going to be a button that says chat. You might be familiar with that if you've used Zoom in the past. In here you can introduce yourselves and also put in any ideas that you might have, and that's what tonight's all about. It's all about ideas. A second button you might see is one called Q&A. That's either going to be down next to the chat button or up in the top of the screen there. If you've got any questions for our panellists tonight, you can stick them in here and then I'll be able to ask them to them at the end of the session. In the Q&A section, you'll also see a little thumbs up button. The more thumbs up a question gets, the higher up the list of questions it goes. So just remember, in the chat, introduce yourselves and have a chat about your ideas. In the Q&A section, pop your questions and any answers you have in there. Well, that's going to be enough for me for the next few minutes. So I'm going to introduce our first panellist tonight, and that's David Davis. David is now retired, but spent 40 years working in the voluntary sector and public service organisations, and his last job was working for the Leicester and Rutland Probation Trust. David's locally moved to Kirby Bellas just outside Melton about 30 years ago, and is currently a member of Kirby Bellas Parish Council. He's also chair of the Rutland and Melton Green Party, and has just recently co-produced a study into how to reduce carbon footprint of village churches in our area. He currently also helps with the development of the community garden and orchard at the Longfield Academy, and during lockdown has been supporting vulnerable families with their shopping. So David, if I can hand over to you just to sort of give us an introduction into what a transition town is.
Right, and how this came about. But really, anyone who listens to the news or reads the reads the papers or watches David Attenborough or anything else knows that the world we've got is in a terribly bad way. COVID, the climate crisis, collapse of biodiversity, a coming mental health epidemic as a result of the COVID lockdowns and so on. And in the face of such overwhelmingly seeming problems, it seems to me that there's kind of two Chinese proverbs that are really sort of appropriate to the situation. One from Confucius, who said, "It is better to light a candle than to curse the darkness." And then from Lao Tzu, who said, "The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step." And I think, as I see it, and I think as we see it, that transition in a sense is about saying, okay, so in the face of that, what can we do? Lots of people have ideas about things, how things could be better. But I think it's about what can we practically do that both helps people to feel better about that they can do something rather than nothing in the face of what feels like overwhelming odds, and get together and work with other local people to make things happen. And there's a whole heap of things that transition towns across the country and across the world have done, and Rob will tell us a bit more about that and how we can go about improving stuff around Melton, and planting trees, doing social care projects, running community gardens and so on. And there's clearly lots of things going on around Melton at present, but we hope kind of bit of inspiration and bring things together and give things a boost. So I won't say any more for now, and hope that you enjoy hearing what Rob has to say.
Perfect. Thank you for that, David. That's a great introduction into transition towns. So I'm now going to introduce our next and main speaker this evening, and that's Rob Hopkins. Rob is the co-founder of the Transition Town network and also of Transition Town Totnes. He's also the author of several books, including The Transition Handbook, The Power of Just Doing Stuff, and most recently, his most recent book is called From What Is to What If, Unleashing the Power of the Imagination to Create the Future We Want. Rob has a PhD from the University of Plymouth and 2 honorary doctorates from the University of the West of England and the University of Namur. He presents the From What If to What Next podcasts and writes and lectures widely. He was once voted one of the Independent's top 100 environmentalists and was on Nesta and the Observer's list of Britain's 50 new radicals. He's also appeared on BBC Radio 4's Food for Thought and a good read in the French film phenomenon Damien and its sequel Après Damien. He has spoken at TED Global and 3 TEDx events. In 2020, Rob was a member of the Cambridge Sustainability Commission on scaling sustainable behaviour and behaviour change. In his spare time, Rob is a keen gardener and founder of the new Line Brewery in Totnes, one of the UK's first 100% community-owned breweries, and as a director of the Totnes Community Development Society. You can find Rob's blog at robhopkins.net, and he also tweets, so if you're so inclined, you can follow him, and that's at Rob in Transition. But right now, Rob is here live with us this evening. So if I can hand over to you, Rob, and take it away.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for that introduction, Alistair. It's lovely to be here with you all, and on such a beautiful day. And I'm going to talk for like 45 minutes, something like that. And I'm going to talk about some of the ideas that were the key ideas in the book that Alistair mentioned, the book about imagination and why imagination is so important. And I'm going to also tell some stories from the transition movement. And I'm going to find my slides because I want to show you some pictures, because a picture is worth 1,000 words, or whatever the expression is. And here we are. Okay, so this is what I'm going to share with you. And my thought for this evening is, let's make the next 10 years feel like a revolution of the imagination. And you'll see what I mean by that, hopefully, by the end. So I want to start with a little bit of what the Extinction Rebellion movement called Tell the Truth. In terms of where are we now? And David gave a bit of a taste of that. I like to think of, and I'm not showing you this as a graph, it's far too late in the evening, you've all had far too long days for any graphs. So imagine this instead is a picture of a mountain. And here we are in 2021 standing on top of this mountain. And the mountain beneath our feet is composed of more carbon, more plastic, more debt, more inequality, more anxiety, more loneliness than we've ever stood on top of before. And for some of us, the view from the top of this mountain is spectacular. We can see further, more remarkable things than anyone ever was able to see before, but certainly not all of us. And the guides who are at our side, who know this mountain really well, are saying, we need to get down off this mountain really quickly. You can see the storm clouds that are coming. We absolutely need to get down off this mountain. And for some of us, that's enough. They're the guides, right? They know the mountain. We should probably listen to them. They know what they're talking about. But for a lot of people, that really doesn't seem to be working. And I can't help wondering if whether a more skillful approach might instead be to tell the stories of the valleys at the bottom of this mountain that are so exquisite and so delicious that we create a longing to get there. Tales of the delicious food that awaits us there, the beautiful wine, the comfortable beds, the dry socks, the warm firesides that await us when we manage to make our way down off this mountain. And then our work is not about facts and figures, which, let's face it, if we were going to turn this around with facts and figures and rational arguments, we'd have done this in the 80s, when, as you can see from this picture, it would have been an awful lot easier. Instead, I think a big part of our work is about imagination, is about storytelling, is about cultivating in our society a deep, deep longing for a different kind of future. And Alistair Gray, the Scottish novelist, once said, work as if you live in the early days of a better nation, which I love so much, I'm going to say it again. Work as if you live in the early days of a better nation. And that work of cultivating longing feels absolutely essential to me, and something that all too often in the green movement, we absolutely don't do enough of. So why imagination? Why am I talking about imagination rather than decarbonisation and so on and so on? Well, I think imagination is really important because one of my favorite definitions of imagination is that it is the ability to see things as if they could be otherwise. If there was ever a superpower that we need to cultivate in 2021, I would suggest it is the ability to see things as if they could be otherwise. You cannot build what you cannot imagine. And if our ability to be imaginative and to sit down and conjure in our imagination a low carbon society in a way that really gets us excited is declining, then we really have a problem. So might that be the case? This is a writer who I love, Walida Imarisha, who wrote a few years ago, whenever we try to envision a world without war, without violence, without prisons, without capitalism, we are engaging in speculative fiction. All organizing is science fiction. I love all organizing is science fiction. Once the imagination is unshackled, liberation is limitless. The imagination is not some kind of fluffy, daydreamy thing. The imagination is fundamentally important. And I take a lot of inspiration from movements like the prison abolition movement in America that for 60, 70 years has kept alive this what if question of what if there were no prisons? What if justice worked in a completely different way? This is a time not for little incremental steps. This is a time for really bold, imaginative ideas. And we have to be able to hold the capacity for that kind of thinking. This is from a book which I'm sure many of you either read yourself as a child or are reading to your own children, or maybe even read to your grandchildren. This is, of course, Green Eggs and Ham, the Dr. Seuss book. What I love about Green Eggs and Ham is the story of how it was created, that he was challenged by his publisher to write a book that just used 50 words. That was his palette that he had to work with. And he always said afterwards it was one of the best workouts his imagination had. It took him 2 years, and he produced one of the most memorable children's books ever. One of the most beautiful things about imagination is that the imagination thrives when it has limits. So if I said, Alistair, tell me a story, that's kind of tricky, right? If I said, tell me a story about the mouse who lives under that thing behind you there, and he has a little blue hat and a little tiny piano, and he has his friends come round to tea on Thursdays, I've put limits around your imagination within which you are able to be much, much more imaginative. And I get to visit many transition groups all across Europe. I don't fly, so that's the extent of the range. If I can get there by train, I go there. And what I see again and again is it's the places who recognize the limits imposed on us by physics in 2021 are by far more imaginative than the people who somehow imagine that those things aren't the problems. So the imagination thrives with limits. It's really important to bear in mind. This is some research that was published in 2010, and it's really important because this was the first research I came across that suggested that, yes, we are living in a time when our collective imagination is in trouble. This was published by a researcher in the US, looked at something called the Torrance test for creative thinking, the kind of gold standard creativity test. Big data sets, 20, 30,000 people, all the way back to the 1960s. Her conclusion was that imagination and IQ rose together until the mid-90s, and then they parted company. And IQ kept rising, and imagination went into what she called a steady and persistent decline. And she found the same pattern in 30 other countries whose data she looked at. When this was published, it made the front page of Newsweek. There was a whole lot of soul searching in America. What does this mean for Hollywood? What does this mean for economic growth? I never heard anybody say, what does this mean for the climate emergency, for the ecological emergency, for the social justice crisis we're facing now? And she blamed the decline on three things: on the decline of play in our society, on the rise of screens, and on the rise of testing in schools. And I think that she pinpointed that parting of the ways sometime around the mid-90s. And I'll come back to this later in the talk. So if we are to cultivate longing for a low carbon future, what do we do? That's really the theme that's going to run through what I want to share with you. How do we cultivate longing for a low carbon future? One way, I think, is by trying to bring it to life using art. And this is the work of an amazing guy called James Mackay at the University of Leeds. And what James does, I always call him the man who draws the future, because that's what he does. This is his drawing of Leeds, where he lives. If in 2021, there was a decision to say, we're going to make Leeds the most biodiverse city in the country. We're going to do everything we can. It's our number one priority. What might it look like by 2030? Well, maybe it'll look like this. And if we can draw it and we can really help to unlock, we can look at this and think, well, what would that world smell like? What would that world sound like? Imagination isn't just about visual things. It cuts across all of our senses. Images like this really help to bring alive what that would actually be like. If we could cultivate the longing in 2021, getting to this really isn't that hard. In the same way, there's been a lot of increase of interest during COVID due to the recognition that exposure to poor air quality is one of the really aggravating factors in terms of COVID. This is his drawing of when we take the cars out of our cities, that frees up an awful lot of space. 2/3 of the surface area of Los Angeles is dedicated to cars. You start to take the cars out of that equation, that's a lot of space. What are you going to do with that space? Well, maybe we fill that space with gardens and our children can walk to school through food being grown, people outside working. You know, in terms of COVID recovery strategies, this is what our urban landscapes should be looking like in terms of mental health, in terms of physical health. Again, if we cultivate the longing, we could create this in 3 or 4 years. This is really not rocket science to actually create, but we have to cultivate the longing first. This is, I'm always on the lookout for things that help people to look at spaces in different ways. This is a very short little animation made by the London National Park City Project, which is an incredible project looking at reimagining London as a national park. Look them up, they're extraordinary. This is a little video they made of Fleet Street. This is Fleet Street today. I'm sure many of you have walked down Fleet Street. We walk down Fleet Street, we think, well, this is Fleet Street. It's always looked like this. It's probably always going to look like this. We can't imagine Fleet Street being anything other than Fleet Street like this. Well, maybe it could look like this. Bringing it alive in this way helps us to have different kind of possibilities lenses in our glasses when we walk around in Melton Mowbray and we're looking at the place that's around us that we've seen every day and we assume they're always going to look like that. Well, when we study permaculture, when we get our transition heads on, we're looking at those spaces in very different ways. What could go where? What would it look like if we gave less space to cars, more space to people, more space to a different way of doing things? And you might be thinking, yeah, Rob, that's all very nice, but actually in the real world, that kind of thing doesn't happen. Well, this is in Barcelona, where a couple of months ago, the municipality in Barcelona announced that they were going to close 1/3 of all of the streets in the center of the city, and they were going to turn them into places for trees, for play, for conversation, for community, as a step forward for the city. It's not like some kind of hippie, let's go back to the whenevers kind of strategy. This is them saying, what do we need to look like in the future? Barcelona's getting hotter and hotter. We're going to need more shade from trees. The last thing we need is more and more cars coming through the city. Let's reclaim that space and do stuff in it that promotes well-being. That works everywhere. It's a kind of a universal constant. And I want to show you a video, and I'm just realizing I'm just going to stop sharing, and then I'm going to share again, because I realized I forgot to tick the little share sound box. And here we are. So as we said at the beginning, I do a podcast series called From What If to What Next, and I'll give you the details of it at the end in case you want to subscribe and get involved with that. One of the things, there's an episode every 2 weeks, and every episode is framed around a what if question. And what I do with the guests is, rather than have 2 guests on to debate, is a universal basic income a good idea, and we have an argument or whatever, what I do is I get 2 people on who we talk about that, but I ask them to imagine it's 2030 and we've had a universal basic income for 8 years. So what's it like to live in a world with a universal basic income? Bring it alive for us. What's it like to live in a world now in 2030 that has a well-being economy, a world where birdsong drowns out the traffic, a world where we have decolonized our education system? What's that like? And I want to show you just 2 little videos. They're about a minute long each that I'm just releasing at the moment, where I cut together some of my favorite bits from the guests. And then I've been working with 2 animators who've brought them to life. And their brief was to animate them in such a way that generates longing for a low carbon future. So anyway, see what you think. This is the first one.
The city really changed since the Ministry of Imagination was born. The city has become a huge laboratory in which everyone can participate.
You can hear laughter, not just the laughter of children, but the laughter of adults.
The place is alive with activity. There's people everywhere doing things.
People can walk freely in their bodies, regardless of their shape, their size, their abilities, their gender expressions, the color of their skin, their age, and there's an embrace of that.
We care about the things that we have. We cherish them, we repair them, we make sure that they will last for a very long time.
Faces are beautifully lined, full of the marks of laughter and a life well lived. It smells like growing things.
So that's the first one, and I showed you the first one.
We're going to be using re in our language. We're going to be rebuilding, refurbishing, remaking, reusing, recreating, reinventing. The re is going to be a big part of our language.
Police and prisons and the armed forces were massively defunded, and that money has gone into robust preventative health care and well-being programs that also contribute to a rich imagination.
Financial insecurity has been eradicated. People no longer go to work.
Yeah, so I hope you enjoyed those, and so the first one of those has already gone up on the blog that I do, and the second one will go up early next week, and the third one will be. So this is what I wanted to share with you this evening. So if you follow me on this train of thought that goes, okay, we have an imagination problem. We are in 2021, where our very survival depends on our ability to reimagine and rebuild the world around us, to reimagine our food system, to reimagine our energy system, to reimagine our education system. And we are surrounded by institutions and organizations who are unable to continued existence as they are forever and ever. We have a military unable to imagine a world at peace. We have a transport department unable to imagine anything other than roads full of cars. We have an agriculture sector unable to imagine anything other than agriculture as it goes. And that's really a problem. So what might it look like if we set out today intentionally to expand our collective imagination? If we have created in many ways a kind of perfect storm of factors that are ruinous to the human imagination, what some people call the disimagination machine, then how do we rebuild that? Whether at a community scale, like in Melton Mowbray, at a national scale, at an organizational scale. So when I finished writing the book, From What Is to What If, I had somebody who was living in my house who was studying for a master's, and he read the draft, and then he wrote his master's that was based on it. And in the conversations that we had, we created this called the Imagination Sundial. And at the end, I'll give you a link. You don't need to be squinting at what all the tiny writing around the edge says. I'm going to give you a link where you can download the whole thing in high enough resolution to do that without risking your eyesight. But I'm going to go through each of the elements that makes up the sundial and tell you some stories. So the first thing is space. You know that the time in your life when you are at your most imaginative is when you have space. Your best ideas didn't come to you when you were really stressed and anxious with a deadline at 8 o'clock.
I think Rob's internet connection seems to have failed us.
Yeah, sorry folks, it does look like we've just lost Rob there. We will do our best to get him back in the next 30 seconds or so. It looks like we have some slow internet bandwidth, so if you just hold on 2 seconds there, folks. Whilst we do work to get Rob back with us, we have had a question that's come in the Q&A box, and just to remind you folks, you can add more questions in there and upvote them as well, and you can also chat in the chat box. The question we have that's come in, David, is from Sue and Peter Karen, who've asked who is on the core team. Perhaps you'd like to answer that for us whilst we try and get Rob back with us.
Okay, there is no core team as such. There's a small group of us who had a conversation at meeting with Melton Green Party that decided that transition was something that was certainly inspiring to us and worth hearing more about in terms of doing something more in Melton. So there's a little group of us that got this evening together, but beyond that, there is no group of people who got any plans or anything like that. I think what we do intend to do is have another session in a week's time where we can reflect on both Rob's talk and also any ideas that people have come forward with, and start to kind of build something from the beginning. So nobody has missed anything yet.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that, David. We're still waiting for Rob to actually join with us. Whilst we do that, if we just take a quick look, see if anybody else has any other questions that have been sent in. I can't see any at the moment, but let's just take a look. No, we don't have any. We've got a question that's just popped up from Herbert Daybell. We've got a question that is, are you thinking of a Melton town transition or a Melton borough transition? What would your thought on that be, David?
Well, I don't live in the town, I live in the borough, but I think that's the kind of question that really needs a wider group to think about. So I think I wouldn't want to, certainly I don't think anybody wants to close anything down at the moment. And let's see how, what other people think.
Perfect. I think we're in a fairly unique position here in Melton and the borough that we have a brilliant community with lots of activities that are going on already. And I think the concept of the transition is to really see what we can do to support those individual activities that happen and also link them together as well. Hello. And Rob has rejoined us.
I was ejected.
Terrible. Okay. Well, you're back with us, Rob. We didn't want to eject you. So,
when did you lose me?
We'd just come to the end of the second video clip, and then it sort of took a bit slow. I think we've got some slow bandwidth issues, unfortunately, tonight, folks. But I think, we've come to the end of the second video clip just after that, so perhaps a minute after that we've got, I think, Rob?
Okay, great. So I was just introducing this, which is called the Imagination Sundial, which is what I want to frame the rest of this conversation. So this is something that was created out of conversation around the book that I wrote, From What Is to What Is, as a way of saying, okay, if we accept that we have an imagination crisis, what do we do about it? How do we rebuild this? This is something, hopefully, which is as appropriate to Transition Melton Mowbray as it is to anybody working on any level of scale, really. And so you don't need to worry about squinting at all the little writing. At the end, I'll give you a link where you can download a high resolution version of this. So there are 4 things I think that we need. If we recognize that we're living in a time of kind of imaginative poverty, almost of what some people call the disimagination machine, and we want to work with the people around us to expand their capacity to see things as if they could be otherwise, what do we do? So the first of those 4 things is space. You all know that in your own lives, the times you're at your most imaginative are when you have space. That kind of, Albert Einstein always said his best ideas came to him when he rode his bicycle through the forest, not when you're stressed out with a deadline and everything's crazy. And so things like this is an event that we did in Totnes just before lockdown started. That was a community what if day, asking, well, what do we do about the climate emergency? Well facilitated. These spaces are so important. The what if spaces that Transition Melton Mowbray can hold in terms of bringing people together in the context of the climate and ecological emergency to say, okay, so what can we create here? What can we do? are so important. I think we need to be looking at a 4-day working week, a universal basic income, all of these things as being vital parts of a national imagination strategy. They all sit within that context. Recently, the chief executive of Netflix said that their main competition wasn't Amazon, wasn't the BBC, it was sleep. And that kind of daydreaming time and that space we're losing out of our lives and out of our culture very quickly at great cost, I think. The second one is place. And what I mean by place is places that you go to where afterwards, when you go home again, you don't look at that place in the same way again. I'm sure all of us have had places like that. It's like when you visit the Centre for Alternative Technology, for example, and you go home, you look at your place in a very, very different way because you've seen all these different possibilities. This is in London on Waterloo Bridge in April 2019, when Extinction Rebellion occupied that bridge. And I know all about it because my wife was there for the whole 2 weeks. And what they did was they turned that bridge, normally thundering traffic going backwards and forwards, awful air quality, into a forest for 2 weeks. And people who worked either side of that bridge and walked across it every day would stop and look at this forest on their bridge and quiet and coffee and food and would say, oh, why can't it be like this every day? And once you've had a taste of things differently, it's very, very hard to go back to how they were before. This is in Houston, Texas, where an amazing organization called Better Block, run by a guy called Jason Roberts, go to places like this and they talk to people around it and they say, what do you love? What does this place need? And then they go back to their lab. They have a sort of fab lab place, and then they work and they make stuff. And then one day at dusk, they arrive in this place. They work through the night. No one quite knows what they're doing. And the next day, they've transformed this place into this. And they've filled that space with conviviality and community and what people long for the future to be like. I like to think of it as a kind of pop-up tomorrow. They create a pop-up tomorrow in that space that changes forever people's sense of what's possible in that place. And we don't always have to be quite that ambitious. This is something I love from San Francisco, which is called Parking Day, which started, I think, about 15 years ago with a group of artists who came together and said, where can we find cheap, affordable space to exhibit our work? Quite hard to find in San Francisco, as you might imagine. And then one person said, well, if you buy a ticket for a car parking space, is there any rule that says you have to put a car in it? If you buy a ticket for a car parking space, surely it's your space for the duration of that time. You can do whatever you like in it. You could curl up and go to sleep in it if you wanted to within the duration of the ticket. So they started this day called Parking Day, where people go and they buy a ticket and they turn that car parking space into a garden, into a library, into a little cafe. I think some people got married in one a couple of years ago, into sculptures, into all sorts of different things. Again, it's a kind of pop-up tomorrow. Transition Liverpool are about to do this when COVID lifts. They're planning a really big, ambitious parking day all across Liverpool. And I love this idea that you just give people a taste of how things can be different and see how much that starts to shift our sense of what's possible. I also think that architecture today has really perfected the art of designing buildings that are profoundly ruinous to the human imagination, glass and steel and concrete, serving the needs of shareholders rather than the poor people who have to walk past them every day. This is the work of Hundertwasser, an incredible Austrian artist who designed buildings. This is the famous Hundertwasser house in Austria. And he said, every building should be like a village. It should have a forest on the roof. It should be this, it should be that. He said, artists should design buildings, and then architects have to figure out how to build them, because architects have forgotten how to build beautiful buildings, and we need artists to do that. And I can't help thinking how different our imaginative lives would be if every day we walk down streets like these, rather than the kind of things that are often built in our cities in 2021. And sometimes a place can be literally a town or a village or a city. It could be Melton Mowbray. It's places that people go to, and afterwards they go home and they think about their own place in a really different way. This is an extraordinary place in France that I visited a few years ago in the Alsace, which is in the northeast west, where it meets Switzerland and Germany up there. So almost German-speaking place where the borders have gone backwards and forwards over centuries. And it was a mining area for a long time. Most people were employed in mining. In the 80s, those mines closed. Lots of people lost their jobs. There was a big recession. There's a guy called Jean-Claude Mensch who worked in the mines. He was a trades union organizer like his father was. He became the mayor in 2011. And in 2012, someone showed him a film about the transition movement called In Transition 2.0, which you can find on YouTube. And at the end of that, he said, let's do that, all of that. And now when you visit Ungersheim, it is an incredible example. They have the biggest solar farm in the region. All of the food in all of the schools is produced in market garden that was created by the municipality on land that they owned, which now trains young people how to grow food. They built a building you can see in the top right-hand corner there to process produce from that market garden to create more jobs for people. They've created more than 100 jobs there through this stuff. They have a local currency called the radish that runs through the whole thing. They have a heritage grains project to supply a bakery in the town. They do, it's phenomenal. There's a film that was made about it called What Are We Waiting For, which I really recommend watching, which tells a year in the life of Ungersheim. And what's beautiful in the film is not necessarily even the projects. It's what you hear is people talking about how over that year, people spend more and more time going to each other's houses for a meal or for a glass of wine or connecting. You see a community starting to weave itself back together again. That film has been shown all over France. It's inspired many other places to do the same thing. One of my favorite things they did was they sold their school bus and they bought a horse. And all the kids get taken to school, pulled in this beautiful carriage by a horse. And when I was there, I did a talk. And pretty much everyone, I think, in the town came. And at the end, one guy came up to me and said, all this transition stuff is great, but that horse is a bit much. I said, what do you mean the horse is a bit much? He said, well, the horse feels like we're going backwards. I said, well, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but actually, you know, I went with the kids this morning in the carriage to school. They were smiling from ear to ear. It was a magical experience for them that will stay with them for the rest of their lives. You know, do we not want to make space for those kind of experiences as well? So place is really important. Things we can do on any size to make a place that you go to and it changes your sense of what's possible in the future. Third thing is practices. What I mean by practices is things that we do together that expand our imagination. One of the things that's most important to recognize about imagination is that to a degree, it is a function of privilege. That if your basic needs on Maslow's hierarchy of needs for food and safety and shelter aren't met, it's very hard to live an imaginative life. I think we need to look at austerity as being an assault on the collective imagination. When you close the libraries, you cut the arts funding, you put more and more people into a state of acute anxiety and stress. It is ruinous to the imagination at the very worst time to be doing that. And this is a part of your brain that's really important called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a part of your brain where your memory and your imagination fire from. Because really what you're doing when you're being imaginative is you're going to the cupboards of your memory and you're looking through the cupboards and you're going, oh yeah, I've got those two things. And it's the moment when you put them together and something unique emerges from that combination. And that's the imagination piece. So we can only be as imaginative as we have interesting things in our cupboards. So one of the things I would really urge you in terms of being imaginative is to really seek out the stories of places doing great things in response to the climate emergency, because the fuller your cupboards are, the more you'll be able to be imaginative. The thing about the hippocampus is that it is the part of the brain that is most vulnerable to cortisol. When we are anxious, in trauma, in stress, it can shrink by up to 20%. And when that happens, we lose the ability to see the future in hopeful and positive ways. And we just get stuck in the past and stuck in the present. So I was really interested to see, as when I was researching the book, could I find somewhere that was deliberately setting out to expand the hippocampus, a kind of a campus for the hippocampus, if you like. And I went to Dundee to visit an amazing project called Art Angel, which is on the first floor of an office block in the center of Dundee. Dundee has the highest rates of inequality and disadvantage in Scotland. And Rosalie Summerton here runs this amazing project called Art Angel. They work with people who have mental health problems, burnout, trauma, stress. When you walk through the door, they say, you're not a patient, you're not a client, you're an artist. You're preparing work for an exhibition, and every year they put on an exhibition in the biggest gallery in Dundee. I spoke to people who were really happy to tell me their stories. One woman said, I spent the last up until 6 months ago, or 6 months ago, I came that close to taking my own life, even though I have two beautiful small children and a partner who really loves me. And since I've been coming here for the last 6 months, I can see the future again. I spoke to one guy who'd worked in local government for 30 years before having terrible burnout and self-esteem problems. I said, so do you think of yourself as an artist? And he paused for a minute and said, aye, why not? So one of the things, you could really see how that was working. And every year at Archangel, to continue their funding, they do like a survey of their artists, and they show them, they give them a piece of paper with two outlines of a human body on, not some big multiple choice questionnaire, just a piece of paper, two outlines of a human body. Fill the first one to show how you felt before you came here. Fill the second one out to show how you feel now you've been coming here for a while. And I looked through a big pile of these and it was really moving. And I just want to share one with you that really, really touched me. When I look at this, firstly, I see the real power of what they do at Archangel. You know, they work in a way that really, really reaches people. Secondly, when I look at this, I feel like if we are to do what we have to do, what the science tells us we have to do to get to being a very, very low, if not zero carbon society within the next 9-10 years, that's what this will feel like. The only way that's going to happen is if it feels like a revolution of the imagination. What would it feel like to live through a revolution of the imagination when anything felt possible? Well, I've never lived through one, but I kind of imagine it would feel a bit like this. And that when we arrive in 2030, we'll feel a bit like this. So I kind of keep this in my mind. This is what gets me out of bed in the morning, this picture. Another practice that has come through the transition movement is this. It's called Transition Town. Anywhere you need between 100 and 400 people, a big space, in this case, Battersea Arts Centre in London. You start by imagining that you're traveling forward to 2030, 2035. It's not utopia, but it's the result of us doing everything we possibly could do. You take a walk around in that future. What am I doing in that future? What's my work? What's my life like in that world? You identify the things you might be doing, and then you find other people who share that interest, and together you design a project, something you would be doing on that high street. And then you literally build it with cardboard and string and sticky tape and pens. To be with 300 adults lost in a world of play is absolutely extraordinary. This was the last time we did it, and this might look to you like two young men sitting on some chairs with some cardboard boxes. As far as they're concerned, this is the public transport system of Transition Town anywhere. They could tell you everything about it, what color the tickets are, what noise it makes, where it goes, everything about this. The poet Rilke once said, the future must enter into you a long time before it happens. And I love that so much, I'm going to say it again. The future must enter into you a long time before it happens. Play can do that. And we exclude play from our activism at great peril, I think. This is so another thing that's really important in terms of practices is the ability to ask really good what-if questions. And a good what-if question involves, opens up possibilities. It's a bit like looking through the little door in Alice in Wonderland that she's too big to get through. And so I want to tell you a couple of my favorite what-if stories. This is from London. This is Hilary Powell and Dan Edelstein. She's a printmaker. He's a filmmaker. They live in Walthamstow. Walthamstow has seen some of the worst impacts of austerity in terms of the rise of debt. They were very concerned about that. Their what-if question was, what if a community responded to its debt crisis with art and playfulness? The last bank on their high street closed down, and they took that bank over. And they turned it into what they called an act of citizen money creation. They filled it with printmakers, making these notes you can see drying here on the line behind them. These are not a local currency. These are like limited edition artworks. They're all signed on the back by Hilary as the bank manager of the bank. They were issued in 5, 10, 20 and 50 denominations. And the idea was to sell enough of these to raise £50,000. During the day, anyone could call in, get involved in printmaking. During the night, it was a kind of community venue for talks and workshops and films about economics, a sort of community education thing. Each of those notes told the story of a local person stepping in to fill the gaps that are being created by austerity. The two Steves run a project keeping young men out of gangs. Tracy is the principal at the local primary school who lost all of their funding for the arts, not a penny to even buy a pencil. Gary was so moved by the food poverty he saw happening in Walthamstow that he mortgaged his own house to turn his garage into a food bank. And Saira and her family feed 200 people 2 meals a day at their own expense because they're so moved by what they see happening. When they had sold enough of these notes, they also issued bonds. You could buy bonds in the bank. It was on Hoe Street. It was called the Hoe Street Central Bank, HSCB. The idea was that then half of that money was distributed among the charities that appeared on the notes. The other half was used to buy back 1.2 million pounds worth of Walthamstow-based payday lending debt, the kind of debt that the poorest people get into, and they bought that debt back and they cancelled the debt. They wrote to everybody and said, you know that debt you had, you don't have it anymore. We don't want anything in return. Have a good life. But by the way, if you'd like to join us on a site overlooking Canary Wharf on the 9th of May, you'd be very, very welcome. And when people went there, there was a van, a transit van, painted gold, filled with bits of paper with the word debt written on it. And at 10 o'clock that morning, they blew the van up in an explosion that had taken them about 3 months to get planning permission for, permission for. And then they painstakingly collected all the pieces, and people who had bought bonds got sent. This is my little commemorative piece of the metal from the van. This is my commemorative piece of the windscreen. It says on here, this artifact is a certified fragment from the wreckage of Big Bang 2, the controlled explosion of 1.2 million pounds worth of abolished debt. Some of us even got sent special commemorative coins minted from the melted down metal from the car. So, you know, when we're looking at doing actions and activism, we could just say we're going to start a petition, or we could take over the bank and fill it with printmakers and talks and blow up vans and make coins out of. I mean, it makes such a difference when you bring a good what if question and imagination into activism. The second what if question I want to share with you is from Liège in Belgium. A few years ago, I went to Liège. The transition group in Liège had come up with a what if question. They said, what if in a generation's time, the majority of food eaten in Liège was grown on the land closest to Liège? They called this project Ceinture Alimentaire, which means food belt, literally. And I went there for a big launch event about 6 or 7 years ago. It was fantastic. They invited everyone who cared about food. And then I went home. I didn't hear very much. I went back 3 years ago. In that time, they created in Liège 25 new cooperatives. They raised 5 million euros of investment, not from the bank, from local people, investing in those cooperatives. They started a farm, 2 vineyards, a brewery. They started a shop in the center of the city called the Small Producers, which was doing so well that after 6 months, they opened a second. They now have 4. They're using this as the model to reimagine the procurement processes for the schools, the universities, the hospitals. The municipality mapped all the land they owned around Liège, had it all tested for contamination, and then offered all of that land to Ceinture Alimentaire for people who wanted to start growing food. I met the mayor of Liège, who said, we used to say we wanted to be a transition city, and then used to say we want to be a smart city. Now we want to be a transition city. This is the future of our city. This is now our story. So you could see a process that started with a what if question that was generated by a community, which then went on to actually become the new story of the city. The municipality said, our job is just to remove the blockages that are in the way of this. It's incredible. But it started because they got a really, really good what if question. And a good what if question is like writing the first half of a really audacious sentence on a blackboard and respecting people's capacity to come up with their own second half to that sentence. What I've loved seeing during lockdown has been the number of transition groups and other organizations inspired by the book who have been using what if as a framing for their thinking about what comes next. This is Transition Bude in Cornwall, who every day for a month posted a different what if question. They're beautiful. What if car parks became play parks? What if birdsong drowned out the traffic? What if our streets were designed for people, not cars? What if there was a daily imagination lesson? What might be some of the what if questions that you might come up with in Melton Mowbray? What are the things that feel most alive in this format? After they had done this for 30 days, on the last day, they just posted this, which I loved because they didn't need to put all of the lettering of what if anymore. People had got the idea after 30 days. But this picture spoke to contentment and conviviality and connection and community, and those things that capitalism can't sell us, but that are the things that we all really, really long for when we get beyond all the desires that are thrown into our face for our short-term gratification. And I'm aware I keep turning rather strange colors. I don't know quite why that is. I'm turned into Bart Simpson right now. I don't quite know why. This is in Sweden, where the Green Party in Sweden ran an advertising campaign where they just put the words "what if" over photos of things that are already happening in Sweden. And this one I think is just beautiful. You know, well, what if we lived in a society where a man could take his kids to the forest for the day just to play all day without worrying about the amount of emails he's got and that he can't really do that and feeling guilty about taking so much time to do that? What if our city food production looked more like this? What if is very powerful, I think. This is a thing that happened in Camden that Transition Kentish Town and XR Camden and Friends of the Earth Camden did with Camden Council. Camden Council were one of the first councils to declare a climate emergency and one of the first to do a citizens' assembly on climate. And after that, all four organizations got together and took over an old cafe on the high street and turned it into what they called Think and Do, which was a kind of a community imagination space. And it was filled every day with workshops, different groups and schools and different groups in the community coming in and doing things together. And again, it was all framed around what if, getting people's ideas. When we well facilitate things, the ideas in our communities are there. There's no absence of ideas. I always think, Gil Scott-Heron wrote his very famous song in the 70s, "The revolution will not be televised." I think if we were doing that again today, we might call it "The revolution will be well facilitated." Having good facilitation skills makes an enormous difference to be able to work with and elicit the imaginations of our communities. And after they had done the Think and Do space for about 2 months, they did a beautiful project where they worked with people from a whole range of different groups across their community and invited them to tell their stories from 2030. Imagine it's 2030. What would you read in the newspaper? Tell us your stories. And they created a beautiful thing you can find online called the Camden Future Journal, which is a 100-page document of all of these stories all beautifully put together. And they also did like a wraparound of their local newspaper. So the local newspaper for 1 week, the front and back covers were all full of stories from a future that turned out differently. So I've done space, places, and practices. The very last one is pacts, which is a weird word to use in relation to imagination, right? Imagination is all like colorful and crazy. Pacts is really important because this is a story from Italy, from Bologna. And in Bologna, the municipality noticed there was a real decline of people being engaged in democracy and a real rise in bureaucracy and a sense that people couldn't change anything. So the municipality created something that was called the Civic Imagination Office. Not a civic engagement office or a civic participation office, a civic imagination office. And what they did is they opened 6 kind of laboratories around the city, and each of those laboratories would run big visioning open space future days to get people's ideas and dreams about the future. And then when people would come up with a good idea, the municipality would say, "Great idea. Okay, how do we make that a reality? We can offer you this, 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 and this. You can offer that and that. Good. Okay, let's make a pact." And in Bologna, in the last 5 years, they've made 500 pacts, which range from small little things like a food garden in a street to taking over an office block and turning it into a school to train young people as classical musicians. It's now the vehicle they use to distribute their participatory budgeting. It's really, really fascinating. And what I love about it is that we have all become so used to the rare occasions our imaginations are even invited, like a consultation about a housing development or something. It's a foregone conclusion. We go along, we write our ideas on post-it notes. We go home, they chuck them all in the bin, do what they were going to do anyway. Our imagination is kind of invited, then kind of ignored, kind of belittled. And what we need to do if we're going to create this sense of people's imaginations being welcomed and cherished and well facilitated is that we have to meet it in the middle. Every organization who has a duty of care over people beneath it has to invite their imagination and then meet it in the middle. That's how we start to create a kind of a resurgence, I think, of the imagination. So that's what I wanted to share with you. And I hope it's something that you might find useful. As I said, it's called the Imagination Sundial, and I will put a link to it in the box when I stop sharing my screen. So just to finish off, to say a little bit about the transition movement. So we started transition here in Totnes in 2005. based on the idea of what can we do here with the people we have, the resources we have. Yes, there's all those things we can do as individuals. We know we need to do: fly less, eat less meat, change our light bulbs, all that stuff. Yes, there's all that stuff that government has to do, absolutely, and international government and business, and we need system change, and we need it to be led by them. Yes, absolutely. But there's that bit in the middle, which is what can we do with the people in our street, the people in our neighborhood? What can we create there that is way bigger than the sum of its parts? Community energy projects, community food projects, which are often dismissed as being kind of a bit sort of small and insignificant. They are so important, and they are such drivers, whether they're small things like planting some fruit and nut trees, starting a seed library, whether they're more ambitious things like starting a community co-housing project, starting a community energy company, really ambitious things like they're doing in Liège. The scale kind of doesn't matter, because what they do is they give people the opportunity to meet and sort of see and smell and eyeball what that future might be like. You get to kind of test drive a low carbon future. You give people a taste of it. I remember visiting the Crystal Palace Food Market, which won many awards in London, started by Crystal Palace Transition Town, won every award for best food market in London. I said, why do you do this? And they said, because we want our children to grow up thinking that this is normal. You know, this is what I see again and again and again in transition groups. What can you do in the place you are as part of an international network, a movement? We call it a movement of communities that are reimagining and rebuilding the world. And these examples are so important. And at their best, what they're doing is building the new economy that governments and local governments don't have the imagination or the experience or the courage to create. We just start with it, and we don't wait for permission, and we start right now. Oh, no, that shouldn't be there. And so just to finish off, and then we'll have your questions, which I'm sure will be far more interesting. If you want to find out more, robhopkins.net is the blog that I do. You'll find one of those videos on that I showed you at the beginning if you want to share that. Transitionnetwork.org is where you'll find out more about the transition movement. And the podcast that I do, From What If to What Next, is a thing through Patreon. So it's like £3 a month, and you get 4 podcasts a month. And then people offer their what if questions, and then I go away and find the best people to explore them. There's like 23 episodes up on there. And if you've read the book and enjoyed the book, it's really the perfect way to keep that exploration going in your own imagination. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. And thank you very much. And I look forward to any feedback or questions or anything like that. Thank you.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Rob. That was really, really inspiring. And as Rob said, it's a great opportunity now to ask questions to Rob. So just a reminder, if you have questions, if you pop them into that Q&A box that you'll see down the bottom of your screen there, if you pop your questions in there, if you have any ideas, things you might like to see happening in Melton and the surrounding area, then pop them in the chat box. So if you have a big idea that you think, oh, why not? Why can't we do that? Pop it in the chat box there, and we'll have a look at that as well. So once give people a chance to ask their questions, Rob, and pop them in there, I think one thing we've definitely learned in the last year from going through this pandemic is that perhaps we had all sort of had a bit of a lack of collective imagination. I think from where we are now, lots of people working at home, a year ago that was impossible, but now it's become, I hate to say the word the new normal, but it really feels like it's here to stay. What do you think will be coming up now that we have more connectivity through the internet? How do you foresee towns changing in the future?
Well, I think COVID has been really, really fascinating. I mean, obviously horrendous and awful, and I don't for a moment want to downplay that at all. But it did away with the myth that governments can't act led by science. You know, the idea before that the government would sit down with climate scientists who would say, this is an emergency, we need to act as if there's an emergency, was considered fanciful and kind of idealistic. With COVID, we've seen they can sit down with scientists who say, this is an emergency, we need to do this, this, and this, and that money isn't a problem. That was so derided, actually, of course, we can find money to do the things that we need to do. Of course, we can change things really quickly. We can repurpose whole industries. Breweries can start making hand sanitizer. Companies that made one thing now start making PPE, and they turn that around within a matter of weeks. We can repurpose an economy to being a low carbon economy in a really short time if we create the right kind of incentives. We know that community is really, really important. We've seen it again and again, that it's communities who've supported each other through this, kind of independent of government. We've seen that. I think a lot of the things that have made COVID worse, so poor housing, in a way, COVID has been like a sort of MRI scan revealing the inequalities that are really running underneath our societies. We can see that the exposure to air pollution makes exposure to COVID, makes, kind of vulnerability to COVID worse. We've seen how important green space and parks have been to people's mental health during this time. We've also seen that actually, as I said, I gave up flying in 2006, and we've created a movement that around the world, without me flying around, starting them all up all over the place. For us as an organization in Transition Network, that's how we've always worked. Zoom, we always have. The idea that an organization can only function if it can fly all of its key people to a breakfast meeting in Paris has been revealed as the nonsense it always was. The idea that academics can only function as academics if they're flying around the world delivering their papers at tedious conferences in different around the world, again, has been revealed as the complete nonsense it was. The idea that we have to take parts of our cities that were thriving, diverse parts of our cities and turn them into just business quarters, offices that now nobody really needs anymore because people from work can work from home, and then they don't need to commute, and then they have more space, is just a complete no-brainer. So I think it's profoundly transformative, and that when we look back and we tell the story of the climate and ecological emergency, COVID will be a key part in that story where our priorities changed, our sense of what was possible changed, and we started to move a lot faster.
Yeah, fantastic. We also have a question that's come in, so just a reminder, you can still ask your questions, folks. It's a great chance to do that. And this question is from Sue and Peter Karen. They've asked, how do you think this all relates to Kate Raworth and the circular economy?
So Kate Raworth is, for people who are thinking Kate Raworth wrote an amazing book called Donut Economics, and now runs a thing called the Donut Economics Lab. And Donut Economics is described as being economics for the 21st century. For me, it's one of the genius ideas of the 21st century, in that it says, whatever we plan to do, whether it's for Melton Mowbray or Los Angeles or the whole world, there are limits. We can't keep pushing out one way because we hit the planetary boundaries. So we put too much carbon in the world, or too much nitrogen into the water, or whatever it is. There are 9 planetary boundaries that we cannot exceed. So we cannot push out, and also we cannot push inwards beyond the things that society can endure. So people being able to live a dignified life, all of those kinds of things. So what it does is it identifies what she calls the sweet spot, or the donut, which is the kind of framework within which we need to operate. And she has a brilliant way that you sit down with organizations or towns or cities or whatever, and you can do a kind of a donut analysis. It says, well, we can't open a massive Amazon warehouse because it would push us too far out this way, and it would increase mental health and poverty and so on and so on. We can't do that. So what are the things that we can do? And for me, as I said before, like donut economics is a beautiful example of that kind of green eggs and ham phenomena, that when you impose those limits, people and their imaginations flourish within that. And I've sat in donut economics workshops in a couple of different places, and you see people who come from quite conventional business backgrounds who, when the donut is explained, even though they normally go, oh no, we don't want to think about that stuff, that's all too complicated and too tricky, and actually they come alive with that. Like, wow, okay, so we can't use too much energy, and we can't do that, and okay, so what do we do, and how could we join this up to this? So I would really recommend Kate Raworth's book Donut Economics, the Donut Economics Lab, is a really brilliant way to create kind of what people are increasingly starting to use this term, which I love, which is imagination infrastructure. How do we create the infrastructure in our communities, in our society for the imagination? What does it need? And I feel like donut economics is really one key tool for our imagination infrastructure.
Fantastic. We also have another question that's just come in. It's from David Abley, who, if I give it a bit of context for you, Rob, I'll read the question and provide a little bit of context for you. So the question is the coming of the MMDR a chance to change the town centre and residential areas for the better? Now, the MMDR is a new bypass that is due to be built starting next year. that will basically take Melton out of the link between three major trunk roads. So it has the potential to change the local area. So how do you think we could work with that?
Well, I don't know, because I've never heard of it before, and I've never been to Melton Mowbray, much to my shame. Apologies for that. So it's kind of hard to comment. I feel like, generally speaking, the thing with roads is that we have to stop roads. You know, we have to be designing and putting in place you know, I don't know how relevant, as well as if we're able to emerge out of COVID in such a way that more people remain working from home, are we really going to see the level of traffic into the future that actually created the need for bypasses in the first place? Are we really going to be seeing a future where those projections of saying the amount of traffic on the roads is just going to rise and rise, and it's our job to just accommodate that endless rise without doing anything to kind of manage it or control it? You know, we need to be doing everything we possibly can to promote cycling, to promoting different things, to having public transport that's so great that why would we ever want to own a car? And, you know, I appreciate in kind of rural areas that gets more and more difficult, but you know, we need to be putting in place that infrastructure, because otherwise that is what will happen. But yeah, I think the idea that we just need to build roads, and I'm also very skeptical about the idea that we're just going to replace the traffic we have now with electric vehicles instead. For me, I always feel like the question we need to have not about alternative cars, but about alternatives to cars and how we do that. And I think when we're able to do that stuff skillfully, then we really start to get away from the idea that we just need to build new roads, and that's what will get us out of it. Because building new roads is massively financially and carbon intensive. You know, big construction projects, I think we really need to be starting to rethink.
Absolutely. And David, would you have any thoughts on that from the local perspective there?
I don't think so. I think do we, you know, what is the alternative to a road, I think is the right question for Rob to be asking. So, you know, because the history, I remember going on what was supposed to be the Leicester Relief Road, the A46 that now leads from Melton to the Ring Road, Northwestern Ring Road around Leicester going to the M1. And on the first days when that road was built, it was wonderful. There was like 3 or 4 cars as I came home from working then at County Hall. And now you go on it at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and it's complete traffic jam. You know, and I think building more roads only actually brings in more cars.
Okay.
Yeah. That's what I always love, that thing people say, if you're in a traffic jam, you are the traffic jam. Yeah.
Absolutely.
You know, it's not like it's appeared out of nowhere. It's like independent of the choices we've made that day.
Super. So we have another question that's come in. It's from Ellie Can't Jump, who has said, I'm from a village outside Melton, which is Bottisford, 3,500 people. We've just written a tree charter and set up a carbon zero team, but this would be a great collective imagination to get going for our residents, and I'd love to invite you to come and help us kickstart the next stage. So how do you think this would fit in? Obviously, Melton is a well, you jumped out of the meeting earlier where we had some technical difficulties. We were discussing the fact that obviously Melton is a town, but there's also the wider borough as well that's made up of villages. There's 2 or 3 larger villages of Bottisford and Ashfordby, and then lots of small villages dotted in between as well. It covers an area sort of 20 miles north to south. How do you envisage a transition group working in such an area?
So I've seen lots of different variations in different places. So sometimes there is a very active transition group, and then the places around don't. I went to one place, I can't remember where it was basically all the villages around were doing transition groups, and they were trying to persuade the town in the middle to get on it, and there was nothing really happening in the town. So it's kind of very different in different places. I think you know, transition is something that I've seen work on every scale. And in the same way that whenever I go to Germany and I give talks about transition and I say, look, here's a project from Italy, here's a project from France, at the end people always say, well, of course it would work in Italy and France, but never work in Germany. And then I go to Italy, same talk and they say, well, of course it would work in Germany and France, it never work here. You know, it's like everybody always assumes that everyone else somehow has the ideal circumstances and they don't. And so I've seen transition work really well at a village scale. I've seen it work really well at a town scale. I've seen it work at a city scale. And I would say that it's really important to have. So if you are in what was it called, Bottingsford?
Bottisford. Yeah.
Bottisford. Sorry. If you're in Bottisford, there are things that you can do there in terms of transition and projects that you can do that would work on that kind of scale. But there's also benefits to being connected and tied into what's happening in Melton Mowbray, and maybe there are things that you can join up and what you can do better than the other, ways that you could share resources. You know, going back to that story of Liège, you know, maybe there are things that can't be done in Melton Mowbray that could be done further out. And the idea of what's called bioregionalism, where you look at the whole area and look in that kind of a way. The reality at the moment is that transition is something that is driven by volunteers, because that's just the way we live in, and occasionally there is some resource for some transition groups. So it really is something driven by what the people who are doing it are passionate about. So what are you passionate about? What could be created? I would also say that one of the things that we always say in Transition Network, which is the hub supporting transition movement, is that all the resources are free. There's a great guide on there called the Essential Guide to Doing Transition, which I'd really recommend. You can download it, and it's the kind of distilled learnings from 12 years of this movement about what works in order to get started. And you know, and we always say it's free. All the resources are free. You don't have to pay a membership. You don't have to become a transition group. There's only one commitment, which is that you share your stories back into the movement, because then it's really a movement of stories and people trying to figure this out. So transition will look different in the villages around Melton Mowbray as it will in Melton Mowbray, but keep talking, keep sharing. You know, often you get transition groups formed, but then you also get sort of self-organized networks. And it's those networks are really interesting because, for example, in Lewes, in Sussex, Transition Town Lewes was one of the first transition groups after Totnes. And they set up their own community energy company called the Ouse Valley Energy Services Company, or OVESCO for short, which has done some amazing renewable energy projects around that area. What they were able to do was to get some funding to then run workshops and mentoring and support for many, many places around them who wanted to start energy projects. So once you start in one place, you can seed it out to lots of different places. And last thing I'd say on that is we did over the last 3 weeks, we ran a summit which just finished on Saturday that was called the What Next Summit. And it was for the transition movement in England and Wales, although we had people from around the world participating in it. And you can find all the videos on YouTube, and I'll put a link in a minute. And the very first event was called the Blizzard of Stories, where we had 12 stories of people-led change in an hour. It was fantastic. And there's a story of Ovesco in there talking about a project they're doing at the moment.
Oh, fantastic. And that sort of leads into a question that came in from John, which is all about sharing stories. And John's question was, your book says that we all need to become better storytellers, particularly of stories about how things could turn out okay. How important do you feel are capturing the personal stories of those voices who are currently not being heard, so as to drive knowledge which could help them inform a transition?
Say the last bit of that again, sorry.
So it was, how important do you feel are capturing the personal stories of those voices who are currently not being heard, so as to drive knowledge which would help inform the transition?
I think it's absolutely vital. And, you know, one of the things that is really important is that we have to diversify the movements that we're part of, and it's something that we made a really, really conscious effort to with the What Next Summit. And if you have a look through the videos in the channel there where they are, I'm just going to put the link. Some really amazing events, and we really made a very conscious effort to diversify the voices we were hearing stories from as part of that. I'm a great believer that sometimes the accusation is leveled at the transition movement that it tends to be white and middle class movement, which is sometimes right, absolutely not always the case. But I think when you have a movement that depends on the idea that everybody is volunteers and that's how it's always going to be, then you tend to, by self-selection, that's who you tend to get. Who are the people who have some time to give to something like this? Who are the people who have a confidence that if you try and change things, they might change, who have that kind of that kind of experience that's relevant? So so it has always felt important to me that the transition movement is able to create work for people and to build new economies. And I'm a great believer that we need to bring a culture to what we do in transition, which is a kind of an entrepreneur's culture. You mentioned at the beginning that I'm involved in a brewery that we run here in Tottenham. It's called the New Line Brewery. You know, we could have designed that brewery to be a kind of volunteer community brewing project or something. Actually, we wanted to create jobs for people. We wanted as many people as possible to be able to pay their mortgage and raise their family, and we employ 9 people, and we'll be employing more people hopefully when COVID lifts and we're able to open our tap room again. And we have 270 owners of that business who share the risk because they really believe in it. And so that thing of building new economies is really important, and basing and gathering stories from all different people is really important. The important thing about that, I think, is, and I mentioned the Transition Town Anywhere project with the cardboard box town thing. The woman Ruth Bentovim and Lucy Neal, who designed that program. That project, they used to run something called Encounters Arts. They stopped it recently, but they both run a training called The Art of Invitation, which I really recommend to people, where they say that actually we have to learn how to do good invitation. If you just put on an event and expect the diversity of the town or the city to arrive, it ain't going to happen. You know, if you really want to get the diversity of a community there, you have to go and invite people. Their kind of maxim is, for any big event you're organizing, you should imagine that 40% of your time and resource goes into the invitation and inviting people. 20% goes into the event itself, and then the other 40% goes into digesting afterwards what happened at the event and then sharing that information out to people. And I think that makes for me, that's a really important sort of mental picture, rather than just we're going to spend 5% of the time putting up posters, 95%, and then 90% on the event, and then maybe 5% afterwards sending out a thank you email to everybody. You know, if we want to reflect the diversity of where we are, it's a conscious effort that has to run through everything that we do.
Fantastic. We also had a question that's come in from Woody Kitson, and it's more of a practical question. He asks, is there a simple list of checks, considerations, advice and pointers for forming an initial group and running local network of individuals and organisations? What should a town or borough of Melton's first steps be?
So I am going to put into the chat here a link to the essential guide to doing transition, which basically has all of that. Yeah, I can't really add much more than to say have a read of that, because what we did was we distilled out everything that we had learned from 12, 13 years of transition groups all over the world, and what are the key learnings. And I always say, you know, we can't. The idea with transition was, if this only happens in Totnes, it really is of no value to anybody. You know, it really has to be something that happens everywhere, and people have to be sharing their learnings. No one knows how to do this, but if enough places are figuring it out and sharing their successes and their failures and celebrating failure and having a culture where we celebrate things when they don't work as much as when they do, so that people feel more invited to take risks, you know, then that's how we're going to figure it out. So that essential guide will really be able to answer all of those questions based on that kind of distilled learning from this movement.
Fantastic. We've also got another question in that's come from Sue and Peter Karen, who simply asked, chaps, where are the women? If I take a partial answer in that, we do have the whole concept of tonight was actually brought up by a local lady called Colette Stein, who is a member of the Rutland and Melton Green Party. She was just a bit camera shy to come on and talk to you all tonight. So there are plenty of women involved in this. This is a whole community-wide effort, I think, and we have to be involved with absolutely everyone. There is no hierarchy. I say in the way we foresee this working is that any idea is a good idea, and everybody's welcome to contribute and take part, as far as I can work out from my point of view.
Yeah, I would add to that every transition group I've met or been involved with has usually been at least 60% women, and sometimes more than that. So yeah, I generally have a rule of thumb when I get invited to go and give talks, particularly kind of physical talks at conferences, that if I'm invited to sit on a panel, an all white male panel, go. And I send them a letter and I explain why I'm not going. And you can imagine my horror about 2 years ago when I was invited to France to go and speak at an event, and I obviously hadn't read the email properly or something. And I arrived at an event where I was on a panel of 11 white guys on the stage, and they passed the microphone round, and I thought, am I going to say something? Yeah, and I said, I'm just noticing that there are 11 guys sat here on the stage and the audience is like 65-70% women. This is ridiculous. How is this considered appropriate? And normally I would never even come to an event where I knew that was going to be the case. And they were terribly apologetic, and they said, well, we did invite 3 women and they couldn't come. I said, that's just really not acceptable anymore, sorry. And like I say, if you have a look at the videos of the What Next Summit that we just did, the kind of diversity built into how we programmed all of that, I think was great, and it benefited so much from that.
Super. So I'm very obviously aware of the time. It's now sort of 8:25, so we won't keep you much longer, folks. I'd just like to open up for the last few questions. If you had any questions, this is now the chance to ask Rob. What I'd also like to do is promote an event we've got coming up in a week's time. So next Thursday, we're looking to hold an ideas workshop. That'll again be online via Zoom, and we'll send you out some information tomorrow about that. And that'll be a chance to come in with your ideas. So take what we've heard from Rob tonight, have a think about it, have a sleep about it, and then come with ideas next Thursday. And you can all come along and take part and put your ideas forward and have a real big community discussion about what we think could change, and ask that question, what if we did something differently here in Melton? So as I say, this is the last chance now you will have to question Rob. So any questions you do have, pop them away now. If we don't have any questions come in, I'd like to thank both Rob and David for joining us tonight. Sorry, folks, about the slightly dodgy start that we had. That is the technology, unfortunately. We'd have loved to have had Rob with us and been all together in one big room and having a discussion from Rob, but obviously COVID has stopped us doing that. But I think as we come now into spring, we've seen some fantastic weather in the last couple of days. I've seen more and more people out walking around in Melton, seeing different things. So thank you all again so much for coming along tonight. It doesn't appear like we've got any more questions coming in. So Rob, anything else you'd like to say?
Just to say, I'm just popping a couple of links in here, one of which is the link to the podcast that I do, and one of which is going to be a link to the Sundial, because I promised that I would give you a link to the Sundial article, so you can download that, which has more examples and some really nice kind of high resolution images of the sundial. And if you find that useful, I'd love to hear more about it. And what else would I say? Well, just thank you and good luck. If you're going to do Transition Melton Mowbray, that's fantastic. And do take advantage of the network. As I said, there's no subscription fees. There's nothing like that. But if you join the network, then you share in a whole movement that's happening all across the country, and all of the learnings from all those different groups. And do keep me posted. It's always lovely to hear of what transition groups get up to. And good luck. Yeah, and thank you for coming along this evening.
Perfect.
And thank you very much for giving your time to come and talk to us, because I think I've found it really inspiring what you've had to say, and just looking at some of the comments on the site, other people have found it that way too. So
great.
Thank you so much, and certainly we'll let you know if anything what happens.
Great, thank you. Please do. Yeah.
Terrific. And that just leaves me to say thank you so much for joining us tonight, folks. We'll leave you to get on with the rest of your evenings. But again, you can get us via email at melton.transition@gmail.com. And we're going to be looking to obviously set up a website and make it a bit easier for people to access in the coming weeks as well. But keep your eyes open for an email coming out tomorrow, just to thank you for coming along tonight, and also invite you to that Imagination workshop that we'll be hosting next week.
It might not be tomorrow, it might be the weekend, but it will come.
Absolutely. Perfect. Thank you so much, folks.